Welcome to our channel. Enjoy our story and don't forget to subscribe.
The last Tuesday we were still a family, I made pot roast. Not because anyone asked, not because it was tradition. We didn't really have traditions by then, not the kind that meant anything. I made it because the grocery store had a sale and because I needed something to do with my hands while I sat across from David at the kitchen table and watched him eat dinner without looking up once. Not at me, not at Marcus, not at anything that wasn't the screen in his hand. That was the thing about David. He never looked at the table setting. He looked at what was on his plate, and even then, only long enough to decide whether it was worth his attention. 12 years of marriage, and that habit never changed. It just got quieter. The way a faucet drips after you think you've turned it off, you stop noticing, but the water's still going. Marcus was 15 by then. Quiet in the way teenagers get quiet when they've figured out that the adults in the room aren't worth talking to. He ate, fast, asked to be excused, disappeared upstairs. I watched him go. David didn't look up. I cleared the plates. David didn't look up. I stood at the sink with the water running and listened to the house settle around me. The tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of Marcus's door closing upstairs. And I thought, this is what it sounds like. This is what the end of something sounds like. Not a door slamming. Just a Tuesday. He told me he wanted out the next night. Wednesday. He was sitting on the edge of the bed when I came out of the bathroom, shoes still on like he hadn't planned to stay long. Like this was a stop on the way somewhere else. And maybe it was. He said it the way someone cancels a dentist appointment. Flat. Businesslike. No preamble, no careful setup. No we need to talk speech that I'd been half expecting for months. He just said it. He wanted the house. The business accounts. The car. Both cars, actually, though he only drove one. Of them. The retirement fund, the savings, everything that had a number next to it, he wanted. He didn't mention Marcus, not as an afterthought, not buried in some rehearsed sentence about co-parenting arrangements and custody schedules and every other weekend visits. He just didn't say our son's name. And the silence where it should have been. That was the thing that landed. Not the rest of it. The rest of it I'd already seen coming. But the silence. The way Marcus simply didn't exist in the math David was doing in his head. So I asked, because I had to. Because some part of me needed to hear him say it out loud, needed to make it real in a way that couldn't be taken back or reinterpreted later. What about Marcus? David looked at me. Not through me. At me. Like I'd asked a stupid question, like I'd asked why the sky was blue or where he kept his keys. Marcus stays with you, he said. I'll be traveling. Traveling. As if the girlfriend, her name was Jenna, 29, worked in marketing somewhere downtown. As if Jenna and the new apartment on Elm Street that I'd driven past 3 times already, just to see it, just to make it real in my mind. As if all of that was simply a business trip. A temporary thing. Something that would end, and then he'd come back and we'd all pretend it never happened. I didn't cry. I need to say that clearly, not because crying would have been weak. It wouldn't have been. But because there was nothing left to cry over. Not anymore. I had already grieved this marriage. I had done it properly, thoroughly, alone. I had grieved it 2 years before David said a single word in a Panera Bread parking lot on a Thursday afternoon in October, with a legal pad on my lap and a highlighter in my hand and a cup of coffee going cold in the cup holder. I sat there for 40 minutes and let myself feel everything. The anger, the humiliation, the specific kind of grief that comes when you realize the person you built your life around stopped seeing you a long time ago and you just didn't notice. I felt it all. And then I picked up the highlighter and I got back to work. Because that's the part nobody tells you about staying in a marriage that's already dead. It's not the lying that eats you alive. It's not the loneliness, though the loneliness is there too. every single night, sitting next to someone who looks at you like you're part of the furniture. It's the planning, the long, quiet, invisible labor of making sure that when the thing finally falls apart, it falls exactly the way you need it to. Not the way he expects, not the way everyone assumes it will go. The woman, devastated, scrambling, fighting for scraps. No. The way you've been building toward piece by piece for longer than anyone would believe. I didn't say any of that to David. I sat on the edge of the bed, on my side. I'd been sleeping on my side for years, a strip of mattress so narrow it might as well have been a twin bed. And I looked at him, and I said, "Okay." Just that. One word. He blinked. He'd been expecting a fight. Not screaming, maybe. David and I hadn't screamed at each other in years. But resistance. Tears, at least. Some sign that this mattered. Some proof that 12 years of shared meals and shared debt and shared silence added up to something that couldn't be dismissed on a Wednesday night. "Okay?" he repeated. "Okay," I said again. He studied me for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's decided he's won something, and he stood up and left the room. I listened to him go downstairs, listened to him pour himself a drink in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd cleared his plate 2 hours earlier, and then I listened to him call someone. Jenna, probably. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't need to. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time after he left, not crying, not thinking, exactly, just sitting, listening to the house, the clock, the refrigerator. Marcus's door still closed upstairs, and behind it, probably, my son lying in the dark with his phone, wondering whether his parents were going to make it or not, wondering whether anyone was going to tell him what was actually happening. I'd tell him, just not yet. Not until I had something worth telling him, something true, not just painful. I hired Linda Marsh 3 weeks after David said the word divorce out loud. Though I'd already spoken to her once before, months earlier in a consultation I'd paid for out of my own account, the one David didn't know about, the one I'd been quietly filling for longer than I care to admit. That first meeting was just reconnaissance. I needed to understand the landscape, how things worked, what was possible, what wasn't. Linda was the kind of lawyer who didn't waste time on pleasantries, which is exactly why I chose her. She was 52, no rings on her fingers, no framed photos on her desk, just degrees and a clock that ticked too loud. She looked at me over her reading glasses the way a mechanic looks at a car that's been driven into the ground and wonders how it's still running. The second time I sat in her office, I brought a folder, a thick one. I set it on her desk without a word and watched her open it. She read for 11 minutes. I counted. I sat in the chair across from her with my hands in my lap and watched her face move through the pages. The slight narrowing of her eyes, the way she turned one page back to check something, the small exhale through her nose when she reached the last section. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at me. "He wants everything," she said, "and you want to give it to him." It wasn't a question. It was a test. She was waiting to see if I'd flinch, if I'd break down, if I was just another woman who'd walked into her office with a bruised ego and a bad plan, ready to throw her life away because she was too hurt to think straight. I didn't flinch. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what I want to do." Linda set down her pen, took off her glasses, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at me. Really looked at me. For a long time. The kind of look that means someone is deciding whether you're brave or foolish and genuinely hasn't figured out which one yet. "Walk me through it," she said. So I did. I started at the beginning. Not the beginning of the marriage, but the beginning of the other thing. The quiet thing. The thing I'd been doing while David was busy being David. It started small. The way these things always do. A bill that didn't match what he'd told me we owed. Not by a huge amount, just enough to make me look twice. I looked twice. Then I looked again. And then I started looking at everything. David ran a small construction company, mid-size actually. We had 40 employees at the peak, contracts across 3 counties. On the surface, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. A solid, growing business built by a hard-working man with good instincts. People respected him. Other contractors wanted to work with him. The bank loved him. Up close, it was hemorrhaging money, not all at once, not in any single dramatic way that would have set off alarms. It was slow, quiet, the kind of bleeding that happens when one person controls the books and nobody else is paying attention. Bad investments that looked smart on paper but quietly destroyed value over time. Debts that got refinanced and buried and refinanced again. Obligations, personal ones that had nothing to do with the business, folded into the company's accounts where they looked like operating expenses. I found all of it. Not in one afternoon, not in one dramatic scene of discovery. Over months, slowly. The way you'd learn a new language, word by word, sentence by sentence, until one day you realize you're not translating anymore. You just understand. I kept copies of everything. Not on our shared computer, not on my phone. I bought a cheap laptop, cash, from a store across town, and I kept it in the trunk of my car, inside a box that looked like it held gardening supplies. Every document I found, I photographed. Every statement, every receipt, every record I could access, I copied and saved. I built a file that was, by the time David made his announcement on that Wednesday night, nearly 200 pages long, and I kept my own money separate. This was the part that would matter most, the part that David, for all his confidence, never thought to question. I had inherited money when my mother died, a few years before we married. Not a fortune. Enough to matter if you were careful with it. David assumed I'd folded it into our joint accounts when we got married. I let him assume that. In reality, I'd put it into a trust, structured, at my mother's attorney's suggestion, to benefit any future children directly. It was legally separate from anything David owned or controlled. It couldn't be touched in a divorce. It couldn't be claimed, disputed, or negotiated away. David didn't know this. He'd never asked. He'd never looked at the paperwork. He'd never once, in 12 years, sat down and reviewed our finances with me. Not really. Not the way partners are supposed to. He looked at the big number, the one at the top of the statement. He saw that it was healthy. He moved on. He never looked at the details. That was his fatal flaw. Not cruelty, though there was cruelty in him too. The lazy, thoughtless kind that comes from never having to try. His fatal flaw was that he never once, in all those years, considered that someone around him might be paying closer attention than he was. Marcus noticed things before I did sometimes. That was the hardest part. Watching my 15-year-old son figure out on his own that his father was lying. Not in the dramatic way teenagers discover things in movies, quietly, the way he did everything. It was a Saturday in November. David had come by the house. We were still living together then, technically, though he was gone most nights, wearing a new watch. One of those chunky, expensive ones that men like him wear to signal something. I don't know what. Worth, maybe. Or taste. Or the fact that he could afford to waste money while the rest of us were supposed to be tightening our belts. Marcus saw it immediately. He didn't say anything at dinner. He waited until David left, until we heard the car pull out of the driveway, until the sound of it faded down the street. And then he looked at me from across the table. He had David's eyes, which was something I'd always loved and was starting to find harder to look at. "Mom," he said, "how much does Dad's watch cost?" I could have lied. I could have said I didn't know, or that it didn't matter, or given him some gentle deflection about how adults sometimes treat themselves. But Marcus wasn't asking because he was curious about watches. He was asking because he'd done the math. He'd seen the way David talked about money. Tight, tight, tight. We can't afford this. We can't afford that. And he'd looked at his father's wrist and done the math himself. He was 15. He was already smarter than David gave him credit for. He was already smarter than most people in this story gave him credit for. I looked at my son for a long moment, and then I told him the truth. Not all of it, not the whole picture, but enough. Enough for a 15-year-old boy to understand that his mother was not the fool his father assumed she was. Enough for him to know that someone was paying attention. Wait, I told him. Just wait a little longer. He nodded. He didn't ask why. He didn't push. He just looked at me with those eyes. David's eyes, but with something else in them now, something that was entirely his own. And he trusted me. That was the moment that mattered most. Not the courtroom, not the documents, not any of what came later. It was that moment at the kitchen table on a Saturday night in November when my son decided to trust me, and I decided, for the first time in years, that I was worth trusting. I went upstairs after he'd gone to bed, sat on the edge of my narrow strip of mattress in the dark. The house was quiet. David was gone. At Jenna's, probably, or wherever he went on the nights he didn't bother to come home. Marcus was asleep, and I was alone with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, because I'd already made it months ago, alone in a parking lot with a highlighter in my hand. I was going to let David have everything he wanted, every single thing, and I was going to smile while I did it. Linda called me on a Monday morning, 2 days after I walked her through everything. I was in the kitchen, my kitchen, still, for now, making coffee I didn't really want, standing at the counter in yesterday's clothes, staring at the backyard like it owed me money. My phone buzzed on the counter and I looked at the screen. Linda's name. No emoji, no greeting, just the name. The way she put it in my contacts, L. Marsh, attorney. I picked up. She didn't say hello. Linda never said hello. She just started talking, the way someone talks when they've been thinking about something all night and haven't slept because of it. I need you to come in, she said. Today, this afternoon. Bring the folder again, the full one, and bring me the trust documents, the ones from your mother's estate. Did something change? I asked. There was a pause, a short one, but I noticed it. Linda didn't pause. Linda was a woman who moved through conversations the way a surgeon moves through a procedure. Precise, economical, no wasted motion. So when she paused, it meant something. No, she said. Nothing changed. I just finished reading everything a second time, and I want to make sure I understand what I'm looking at before I do anything else. I understood what she meant. She was looking at me the way she might look at a hand of cards she hadn't expected to be dealt, reassessing, recalculating, figuring out whether the game had changed or whether she'd just been playing it wrong from the start. 2 o'clock, I said. 2 o'clock, she said, and hung up. The mediation session started in December. David's attorney, a man named Robert Garrett, mid-50s, graying at the temples in a way that looked distinguished rather than tired, contacted Linda to set up the first meeting. Robert was competent, careful, the kind of lawyer who reads the fine print not because he's suspicious, but because it's habit. He'd been doing family law for 23 years, and you could see it in the way he carried himself. Steady, unhurried, a little sad around the eyes. He knew how these things ended. He'd seen 1,000 of them. I liked him, actually. Or I would have, under different circumstances. He was the one person on David's side who actually made me nervous. Not because he was hostile, but because he was paying attention. More attention than David was, certainly. More than David wanted him to. The first mediation was held in a conference room on the 4th floor of a beige office building downtown. Fluorescent lights, a long table with too many chairs, a pitcher of water that nobody touched. David sat on one side with Robert. I sat on the other with Linda. And between us, a mediator named Carol, who had the look of a woman who had watched marriages dissolve across this exact table so many times that she'd stopped flinching years ago. David walked in like he was attending a business lunch. Pressed shirt. The expensive watch. Not the one Marcus had noticed. A newer one. Shinier. As if he were trying to prove a point to an audience that wasn't there. He smiled when he saw me. Not a cruel smile. A confident one. The smile of a man who believes he has already won and is just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I smiled back. Smaller. Quieter. The kind of smile that says, yes, of course. Whatever you want. Linda, sitting next to me, didn't react. But I felt her shift, just slightly, in her chair. She was watching David with quiet, professional interest. The session lasted 2 hours. David laid out his demands clearly, calmly, almost cheerfully. The house, the business and all its accounts, the cars, the joint savings, or what he believed were the joint savings. He wanted a clean split, he said. No alimony. Minimal child support. He used the word minimal, and I watched Robert's jaw tighten, just barely, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. And then it was my turn. I asked for almost nothing. The apartment I'd already been looking at, a small 2-bedroom across town, nothing fancy, close enough to Marcus's school, a portion of the joint, checking account to cover moving costs, and shared custody, 50-50, though I framed it gently, as though I understood if David needed time to settle into his new life before taking on the responsibility of weekend visits. David stared at me. He couldn't help it. He'd walked into that room expecting a fight. Not a screaming match, not necessarily, but resistance. Negotiation. The usual tug-of-war that divorce becomes when both sides have something to lose. And instead, I was sitting across from him, handing him everything he'd asked for, wrapped in a bow, with a smile on my face that said, "Isn't this easy? Isn't this painless? Didn't I make this simple for you?" Robert leaned over and whispered something to David. I couldn't hear it. David waved him off, a small, dismissive gesture, the kind he used on everyone who wasn't telling him what he wanted to hear, and nodded at Carol. "I think we can work with this," David said. Linda said nothing. She wrote something down, in her legal pad, one line, neat and precise, and closed it. We shook hands at the end of the session, the way adults do in a room full of strangers. David's hand was warm, dry, confident. He held mine a beat too long, the way he always did when he thought he was being charming. I let him. The thing about playing a part is that you have to commit to it completely, or it falls apart. Half measures don't work. If you're going to be the defeated woman, the one who's given up, the one who just wants it to be over, the one who's too tired to fight, then you have to be that woman in every room, every interaction, every quiet moment that someone might be watching. And someone was always watching. Her name was Karen. Karen Bellamy. We'd been friends, or something close to friends, the kind of friendship that forms between women who've been in the same social orbit for long enough that it starts to feel like loyalty. For almost 15 years. She lived 3. Streets over. She knew everyone. She knew everything, or thought she did. And she had a habit that I'd noticed years before it became relevant. She talked. Not maliciously, not with any particular intent. She just talked, the way some people breathe, constantly, automatically, without thinking about where the air goes after it leaves their mouth. Karen knew about the divorce. Of course she did. David had told her first, before me, actually, which I found out later, and which hurt less than it probably should have. He'd always liked Karen. She was easy to talk to. She laughed at his jokes. She told him he was brilliant, charming, unfairly talented at everything he touched. She believed it too, or at least she believed it. People like Karen don't lie so much as they perform. They shape themselves around whoever is in the room, reflecting back whatever that person most wants to see. It's a useful quality in a friend. It's a devastating one in an enemy. But Karen wasn't my enemy. That's important. She was something worse in a way. She was a weakness, a crack in the wall through which information flowed freely without friction, without anyone noticing it was happening. David told Karen things. Karen told other people. Those other people told David's attorney, or David's mother, or someone at the gym, or someone at the school pickup line. And eventually, the information came back around to David, laundered clean, as though he'd figured it out on his own. He hadn't figured anything out on his own in years, but he didn't know that. So I started feeding Karen. Not obvious things, not anything that would raise her suspicion or make her question what she was hearing. Small things, careful things, the kind of details a defeated woman might let slip over coffee. A sigh here, a confession there, things that painted a picture. I was struggling. I was scared. I was thinking about taking a settlement that was far less than what I deserved because I didn't have the energy to fight. Karen listened with wide eyes and a sympathetic tilt of her head. She squeezed my hand across the table at the cafe. She said all the right things. You deserve better. You shouldn't let him push you around. Have you talked to your lawyer about this? And I nodded and dabbed at my eyes with a napkin and thanked her for being there. And then she called David. I know she did because the next mediation session, David was even more relaxed than before, more confident. He sat in that beige conference room like a man who had already started decorating the new apartment in his head, already planned the celebration dinner, already moved on from the marriage the way you move on from a job you hated, with relief, not regret. He wasn't reading the documents carefully. He wasn't asking Robert to explain the details. He was signing where he was told to sign, initialing where he was told to initial, and smiling the whole time. Linda watched, him from across the table, and I could see it in her eyes. The same look she'd given me that first afternoon in her office. Only now it wasn't aimed at me. "He's not reading," she said to me afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, while David and Robert were still inside. She said it quietly, almost to herself, not with satisfaction, with something closer to unease. "He's not reading any of it." "I know," I said. Linda looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she smiled. It was small, barely there, the kind of smile you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. But it was real. "Good," she said. There were nights when the mask slipped, not in front of anyone, not where it mattered, but alone, late, after Marcus was asleep, after the house was quiet and the only light was the lamp on the kitchen table where I sat with my laptop and my coffee, and the folder that had become, by then, a binder, a thick one, organized by date, by account, by category, color-coded tabs, everything in order. There were nights when I sat in that kitchen and stared at the numbers and felt the fear move through me like cold water. Not fear of David. I'd stopped being afraid of David a long time ago. Fear of the thing itself, the plan, the whole architecture of it, the dozens of moving pieces that all had to land exactly where I'd put them. Fear that I'd missed something, that one number was wrong, that one document was incomplete, that somewhere, buried in the maze of David's finances, there was a piece I hadn't found, and that piece would blow the whole thing apart. One night in January, a Thursday, I think, though the days had started to blur together by then, I was going through the business accounts for the 4th time. The 5th, I'd lost count. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. The house was completely dark except for the circle of light around my laptop. Outside, it was raining, the kind of steady, flat rain that sounds like static. I found a discrepancy, not a big one, a number that didn't match, a transfer that went somewhere I hadn't traced before, a subsidiary account buried inside another account that I'd somehow overlooked in all my previous passes through the records. My stomach dropped. The kind of drop that feels physical, like the floor tilting under you. If this account held what I thought it might hold, assets, legitimate ones, things that could be claimed and valued and used to offset the liabilities I'd so carefully documented, then the whole thing could fall apart. David's attorney could use it. The judge could use it. Everything I'd built could crumble because of one account I'd missed on a Thursday night in January while it rained outside my kitchen window. I sat there for a long time, not moving, not breathing almost, just staring at the screen. And then I started tracing it. It took me 3 hours. 3 hours of moving through records, cross-referencing, statements following the thread of that transfer from one account to another until I found where it led. And when I found it, when I finally understood what that account was and what it contained, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. It was empty, drained. Another one of David's quiet disasters. Money moved in, money moved out. Nothing left but the shell of an account and a paper trail that proved once again that the man I'd married was very good at looking successful and very bad at actually being it. I closed the laptop, sat in the dark kitchen for a while, listening to the rain. My hands were shaking. Not a lot, just enough that I noticed. Then I made a fresh cup of coffee, opened the laptop again, and added the account to the binder. Marcus asked me a question in late January that stopped me cold. We were in the car. I was driving him to school, the way I did every morning. The same route, the same silence that had become comfortable between us over the years. He was looking out the window, watching the street go by, and then, without turning his head, he said, "Mom, are you scared?" Not about the divorce. He didn't say about the divorce. He just asked if I was scared. And the way he asked it, quietly without looking at me, giving me the space to lie if I needed to, told me that he already knew the answer. I could have lied. It would have been easy. "No, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine. Don't worry about grown-up stuff. The standard script. The thing parents say when they don't want their children to carry weight that isn't theirs to carry. But Marcus wasn't a child anymore. Not really. He was 15, and he was smarter than almost every adult in this story, and he had been watching his father lie for long enough to know what lying looked like. If I gave him the script, he'd know. He'd know I was doing it, and he'd know why, and he'd stop asking me questions altogether, and I couldn't afford that. I needed him to keep trusting me. I needed him to keep talking to me, because in the end, in the quiet, unglamorous end that was coming, he was the only person in the world who was going to understand why I did what I did. "Yes," I said. "Sometimes." He nodded, still looking out the window. "But not of him," I added, because that was true too. The fear wasn't of David. It was of the math, of the plan, of the possibility that I'd miscalculated somewhere, that one thread would unravel and pull everything down with it. Marcus turned to look at me then. Really look at me. And his face. God, his face. He looked like David. He always had. The same jaw, the same eyes. But the expression was entirely his own. Steady. Clear. Old in a way that 15-year-olds aren't supposed to be old. "You haven't," he said. "Miscalculated. I checked." I almost crashed the car. Not literally. I was going 35 in a school zone, and my hands were on the wheel, and everything was fine. But something shifted inside me. Something that had been wound tight for months, years maybe, loosened, just a fraction. Because my son had been looking at the same numbers I'd been looking at. He'd been checking my work, and he was telling me, in his quiet 15-year-old way, that it was solid. I didn't ask him how he'd found the documents. I didn't ask what he understood and what he didn't. I just looked at the road ahead of me and drove. And after a moment, Marcus turned back to the window, and we rode the rest of the way to school in the same comfortable silence we always had. When I pulled up to the curb, he grabbed his backpack and opened the door. Then he paused, one foot on the ground, one still in the car, and looked back at me. "It's going to work, Mom," he said. He said it the way someone states a fact, the way you'd say the sky is blue or water is wet, not with hope, with certainty. And then he closed the door and walked into school, and I sat in the car for a full minute before I pulled away from the curb because my hands wouldn't stop shaking and I didn't trust myself to drive until they did. The final documents were ready by the last week of January. Linda had reviewed everything, not once, not twice, but 5 times. She was meticulous in a way that bordered on obsessive, and I loved her for it. Every page, every number, every clause and subclause and footnote. She checked it against the binder, against the trust documents, against the business records I'd collected over 2 years of quiet, invisible work. "It's clean," she told me on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting across from me in her office with her glasses off and her hands folded on the desk. "It's airtight. If he signs this, and I mean if he actually signs it without a financial review, without his attorney doing a full audit of the business assets, then everything attached to that signature becomes his. The house, the business, the accounts, all of it." She paused. "Including the debt," she said. "Including the debt," I repeated. Linda nodded. She picked up her pen, set it down again. Then she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, something between respect and a kind of quiet, professional awe. The look of a woman who had spent decades in courtrooms and had just realized she was sitting across from someone who had done something she'd never seen done quite this way before. "You understand," she said slowly, "that if his attorney catches this before he signs, if Robert Garrett does his job the way he's supposed to do it, this whole thing falls apart. David gets a lawyer who actually reads the fine print. He gets a financial advisor to review the business, and everything you've built goes back into the pile for negotiation." "I know," I said. "So the only way this works," Linda continued, "is if David signs without looking." I looked at her, and I thought about 12 years of marriage, 12 years of watching this man move through the world like it owed him something, 12 years of watching him sign things, tax returns, mortgage documents, insurance forms, without reading a single word, 12 years of knowing with absolute certainty that David believed the paperwork was beneath him, that the details were someone else's problem, that the numbers would always work out in his favor because they always had before, and because he was David, and David always won. "He'll sign," I said. Linda held my gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Slow and firm, like a door closing. "Then let's get ready for the hearing," she said. The week before the hearing, Karen called. I almost didn't pick up. I was in the small apartment by then, the 2-bedroom I'd moved into in early February, after David and I had signed the preliminary separation agreement. It was fine, clean, a little cold in the mornings, the way old buildings are, with drafty windows and radiators that clanked and groaned like something living. I'd put Marcus's room together first. His bed, his books, a poster on the wall that he'd chosen himself. My room was still mostly empty. A mattress, a lamp, a box of clothes I hadn't unpacked yet, Karen's name on my phone. I looked at it for a long time before I answered. "How are you doing?" she asked. The voice of concern, the tilted head I could hear even through the phone. "I've been so worried about you. David told me you seemed really down at the last session." David told her. Of course he did. Karen was his mirror, the surface he looked into to see himself reflected back as the reasonable one, the wronged party, the man who'd tried. She was useful to him, and he was useful to her in his way. He made her feel important, included, like she was part of something bigger than her own small life. "I'm okay," I said, "just tired." "You know you can talk. To me," Karen said. "About anything. I'm here for you." She meant it. That was the thing about Karen that made her so dangerous. She genuinely believed she was a good friend. She genuinely believed that listening to David's side and then gently relaying what she'd heard back to me was a form of loyalty. She didn't see the leak. She didn't see the pipeline. She saw herself as a bridge between two people she cared about, smoothing things over, keeping the peace. People like Karen are everywhere, in every marriage, in every neighborhood, in every circle of friends where someone, somewhere, is saying too much without meaning to. They're not villains. They're just open doors, and the wind blows through them without asking permission. "Thank you, Karen," I said. "I'll call you soon." I hung up and sat on the edge of the mattress in my empty bedroom and stared at the wall. Not with anger, with something quieter than anger. Something that felt almost like pity. For Karen. For David. For all the people in this story who had looked at me for 12 years and seen exactly what I wanted them to see. A woman who wasn't paying attention. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark in the apartment. Marcus asleep in the next room, the city quiet outside, the radiator doing its thing. And I stared at the ceiling and went through everything one more time. Not the documents. I knew the documents. I could have recited them from memory by then, page by page, number by number. I went through the logic of it, the sequence, the chain of events that would unfold in that courtroom the next morning, step by step, the way a pilot goes through a checklist before takeoff. David would arrive confident. He would sign. He would not read. Not really, not carefully, not the way a man signs something that is about to change his life. He would sign the way he had signed everything for 12 years, quickly, carelessly, trusting that the numbers would sort themselves out. Robert would be there. Robert would do what good attorneys do. He would review the package one final time before everything was made official. And somewhere in that review, he would find it. The liability disclosure, the full accounting of the business debts, the undisclosed obligations, the obligations David had spent years burying, all of it, attached to every asset David was about to claim as his own. Robert would find it, and Robert would whisper, and David would read, and David would understand. I turned on my side, closed my eyes, opened them again. The ceiling stared back at me, blank and indifferent. I thought about my mother, about the afternoon she sat me down. I was 19, home from college for the summer, sitting on the back porch with a glass of something I was too young to be drinking, and told me the one piece of advice she ever gave me that I actually remembered. "Pay attention to the money," she said, "not the big stuff, the small stuff, the stuff nobody talks about. That's where the truth lives." I'd thought she was talking about her own marriage, a long one, complicated, full of the kind of quiet compromises that marriages are made of. Maybe she was, but she was also talking about the world, about the way power works, about the way people moved through life assuming that no one was keeping score. Someone is always keeping score. I lay there in the dark and I thought about my mother, and I thought about Marcus asleep in the next room, and I thought about the binder sitting in Linda's office, 212 pages of documentation that represented 2 years of the most careful, most invisible, most deliberately quiet work I had ever done in my life. And I thought, tomorrow the score catches up. I closed my eyes. I didn't sleep much. But when morning came, I got up, got dressed, drank my coffee standing at the kitchen counter in the gray winter light, and drove to the courthouse feeling steady, quiet inside, the way a thing feels when it has finally stopped fighting itself. The courthouse was older than I expected, not the grand kind of old, not marble and columns, and the feeling that justice was being dispensed from somewhere important. It was the other kind of old, worn, tired. The kind of building that has seen so many ordinary disasters that it stopped being surprised by any of them a long time ago. Scuffed linoleum, fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious annoyance, but that you felt anyway, like a low-grade headache you couldn't quite place. Wooden benches in the hallway that had been polished by decades of people sitting on them, waiting for their lives to be rearranged by a stranger with a gavel. I sat on one of those benches for 20 minutes before the hearing started. Linda was inside, reviewing the final documents one last time. Marcus was at school, a Tuesday, a normal school, day, and I'd made the decision weeks ago that he would not be here for this. Not because I didn't want him to see it, because I didn't want him to have to sit in a room and watch his father's face when it happened. Some things a 15-year-old shouldn't have to witness, even if he's old enough to understand them. I'd told him the night before. Not everything. Not the specific mechanics of what was going to happen in that courtroom. But enough. Enough for him to know that by the end of tomorrow, things would be different. That the plan, our plan, though we'd never called it that out loud, was going to play out the way we'd built it to play out. He looked at me across the kitchen table in the small apartment, his backpack still on one shoulder, still half in his jacket, and he'd nodded. Just once. The way he did when he understood something completely and didn't need it, explained further. "Call me after," he said. "I will," I said. And then he'd gone upstairs, and I'd sat alone at the table with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I'd stared at the wall and tried to remember the last time I'd felt anything close to what I was feeling right now. Not fear, not excitement. Something quieter than both. Something that felt like the moment before a long exhale. The held breath, the stillness, the knowledge that something is about to shift and there's no going back once it does. David arrived at 10 minutes to 9. I saw him from the hallway. He came through the main entrance with Robert at his side, and he looked exactly the way I'd expected him to look. Put together, unhurried, confident in the way that men like David are confident when they believe they've already won. Pressed shirt, dark jacket, the watch, a different one this time, newer, shinier, as though he were celebrating something that hadn't quite happened yet. He was talking to Robert as they walked, gesturing with one hand, and I could tell from the way Robert was listening, half-turned, nodding without expression, that David was talking about what came next, not the hearing, what came after the hearing, the new apartment, the business, freed from the weight of a marriage he no longer wanted, the fresh start he'd been planning since long before he said the word divorce out loud. He hadn't seen me yet. I watched him for a moment from the bench, the way he moved through the space, the way he owned it without trying, the way every person in the corridor unconsciously shifted to make room for him. It was a talent a gift even, the ability to take up space in a way that made other people feel smaller. I'd spent 12 years in the shadow of that talent, and for most of those years, I hadn't even noticed I was standing in it. Then he looked up, saw me, and smiled. It was the smile, the one I remembered from the beginning, from the first time we met at a party I almost didn't go to in a kitchen that smelled like someone's bad attempt at a dinner sauce. He'd smiled at me across the room, and I'd smiled back, and the whole thing had started the way these things start, with a feeling that the world was bigger than it had been 5 minutes ago. 12 years later, sitting on a scuffed wooden bench in a tired courthouse, he smiled at me the exact same way. And for just a second, just a flash, gone before I could hold it, I felt something. Not love, not anymore, but the ghost of it. The memory of what it was like to be looked at by someone who made you feel like you were the only person in the room. I smiled back. Smaller. Quieter. The way I always did now. "Morning," he said, walking past me toward the courtroom. He didn't stop, didn't slow down, just said it, the way you'd say it to a neighbor you passed on the sidewalk. Pleasant, forgettable, meaningless. I let him go. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Not the grand wood-paneled spaces you see in movies. This was a working room, functional. A judge's bench at the front, 2 tables facing it, chairs lined up behind each one for attorneys and parties. The judge herself was already seated when Linda and I entered. A woman in her early 60s, silver hair pulled back, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, flipping through a file with the brisk efficiency of someone who had a full docket and intended to keep things moving. Judge Patricia Holloway. I'd read about her beforehand. Linda had given me a 1-page summary, dry and factual, the way Linda gave everything. 28 years on the bench, family law specialist, known for being fair, thorough, and completely unmoved by drama. She doesn't care who cried more, Linda had told me. She cares about what's on paper. Good. Paper was my language. David and Robert were already seated at their table. David was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped across the back of the empty seat next to him, relaxed, in the way a man is relaxed when he's doing something routine. Robert sat straighter, a folder open in front of him, scanning the first page with the careful, practiced eye of someone who reads legal documents the way other people read the weather, automatically, habitually, looking for signs. Linda and I took our seats. She opened her own folder. The binder, finally, all 212 pages of it, bound and tabbed and organized with the kind of precision that only a woman like Linda could produce. She didn't look at David. She didn't look at me. She looked at Judge Holloway and waited. The judge looked up from her file. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was flat, professional, the voice of a woman who had said good morning in this exact room thousands of times and meant it as a procedural statement, not a pleasantry. "We're here today to finalize the dissolution of marriage between David and," she glanced at the file, "and to execute the settlement. Agreement as negotiated. Both parties are represented by counsel. Both parties are present. Is that correct?" Robert confirmed. Linda confirmed. "Very well," the judge said. "Let's begin." The signing took less time than I thought it would. The settlement agreement was 43 pages long, 43 pages that represented, in the language of the law, everything David and I had built together over 12 years, and everything we were about to stop sharing: the house, the business, the accounts, the assets, the debts, the future, all of it, reduced to numbers and clauses and signatures on lines. David signed first. He took the pen from Robert, a plain black pen, nothing special, the kind you'd find in any office drawer. And he moved through the pages the way he moved through everything, quickly, confidently, without hesitation, page after page, initial here, sign there. He didn't read. He glanced, the way you glance at a menu when you've already decided what you want, scanning for the familiar word and then moving on. His eyes moved across the text but didn't land, didn't settle, didn't catch. Robert watched him sign. I watched Robert watch him sign, and I saw it. The faintest tightening around Robert's eyes, the smallest shift in his posture. He wanted to say something. I could see it in the way his hand moved, almost imperceptibly, toward David's arm. The instinct to stop him, to say, "Wait, hold on, let me look at this more carefully." But David was already turning the page, already moving to the next signature line, and Robert, because a lawyer can only advise, not force, let it go. David signed the last page, set down the pen, leaned back in his chair and looked at the judge with an expression that was almost jovial, almost proud, the expression of a man who had just closed a deal he was pleased with. Judge Holloway nodded, turned to me. "Miss Ellison," she said, "your signature, please." I stood, walked to the table. Linda handed me the pen, a different one, hers, a good one, the kind of pen that feels substantial in your hand. I sat down in front of the 43 pages and I began to sign, but I signed slowly, page by page, line by line. I read every word before I put my name to it. Not because I didn't know what it said, I knew it better than I knew my own handwriting at that point, but because I wanted to, because after 2 years of being invisible on purpose, of making myself small and quiet and easy to overlook, I wanted to sit in that room and take my time. I wanted David to watch me do it. I wanted him to see me, really see me, for the first time in years. Not as the defeated woman, not as the woman who had given up, but as someone who was choosing, deliberately, with full knowledge of exactly what each page meant. He noticed. I could feel his eyes on me from across the table, not with concern, not yet, but with mild impatience. The impatience of a man who had already moved on in his mind and couldn't understand why the paperwork was taking so long. I kept signing. Page 17, page 22, page 30, each one deliberate, each signature placed exactly where it needed to be, in exactly the right spot, with exactly the right pressure. Linda sat beside me, still and quiet, watching my hand move across the paper the way a conductor watches the orchestra, not directing anymore, just listening, making sure everything was landing where it was supposed to land. Page 41, page 42, page 43. I signed the last line, set the pen down, folded my hands in my lap, and looked up at Judge Holloway. "Done," I said. The judge nodded. She reached for the documents, both sets, David's and mine, and began her own review. This was standard procedure. The judge reviews the final package before it becomes official. She checks for completeness. She verifies that both parties have signed where required. She makes sure nothing is missing. It took her 4 minutes. 4 minutes of silence in that small courtroom. The only sound the quiet rustle of pages turning and the persistent buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. David sat across the table, arms crossed, waiting. Robert sat beside him, one hand resting on his own closed folder, watching the judge with an expression of professional patience. Linda sat beside me, very still, very calm. But I felt it, the slightest tension in the air around her, the way a held breath feels different from a normal one. She was waiting for something. So was I. The judge finished her review, looked up, opened her mouth to speak. And that's when Robert moved. It happened fast, faster than I expected, and I'd been expecting it for months. Robert leaned forward, not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies where someone jumps up and slams their hand on the table. He simply leaned forward quietly and pulled David's copy of the settlement agreement toward him. He opened it to a section near the back. Not the signatures, not the property division, the financial disclosure, the attachment, the pages that detailed, in full, the complete financial picture of every asset being transferred. He read. His eyes moved across the text, slowly at first, scanning, the way he'd been scanning all along. And then they stopped. Stopped on a specific line, a specific number, a specific paragraph that described, in the precise and bloodless language of legal documents, the full extent of the debts attached to the business David had just signed for. I watched his face change. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. The kind of change you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. A slight widening of the eyes, a tightening of the jaw, the color draining, Not all at once, but gradually, like water leaving a glass through a crack at the bottom. He read the paragraph again, then he turned the page and read the next one. And the next. His eyes moved faster now, scanning with a different kind of urgency. Not the lazy scan of routine review, but the focused, almost frantic scan of someone who has just realized they are looking at something they should have seen weeks ago. He set the document down, very carefully, the way you set down something fragile or something dangerous. And then he leaned over to David and whispered. I couldn't hear the words. I wasn't meant to. But I watched David's face as Robert spoke, watched the confidence drain out of it the way it had drained out of Robert's, only faster, only more completely. David's eyes moved from Robert's face to the document, to the page Robert had been reading. He picked it up. He read. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Holloway watched all of this with an expression that hadn't changed since she'd first looked up from her file that morning. Steady, neutral, mildly attentive. She had seen this before. Maybe not this exact version of it, but something close. The moment when a party realizes, too late, that the thing they just signed is not what they thought it was. David read for a long time. I watched his eyes move across the page, watched them slow down, watched the blood leave his face in stages, watched the way his jaw tightened and then went slack and then tightened again. He was doing the math, the real math, the math that lived in the details, in the small stuff, in the stuff nobody talks about, the stuff where the truth lives. When he finished reading, he set the document down on the table. He didn't look at me. He looked at the judge. Your Honor, he said. His voice was different, flatter, stripped of the confidence it had carried when he walked into that room an hour ago. I'd like to request a delay. I need time to review. Mr. Ellison, Judge Holloway interrupted. She said it gently but firmly, the way a teacher says a student's name when the student is about to say something that is going to embarrass them. You signed the agreement. Your attorney was present. The financial disclosure is attached to the document you initialed on page 31. Did you review that disclosure before signing? Robert beside him closed his eyes. Just for a moment. The briefest, most human gesture I'd seen from him all morning. David opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He started. Mr. Ellison, the judge said again, did you review the financial disclosure before signing? The silence that followed was the longest silence I had ever sat inside. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe 4, but in that courtroom, with the fluorescent lights buzzing and the scuffed linoleum and the decades of ordinary disasters that had played out in this exact room before ours, those 3 or 4 seconds felt like something enormous, something irreversible, the kind of silence that closes a door. David looked at Robert. Robert, to his credit, did not look away. He met his client's eyes and held them, and in that look, in that quiet, professional, deeply sad look, was everything a lawyer cannot say out loud in a courtroom, but that both of them understood perfectly. No, David said. His voice was barely above a whisper. I did not. Judge Holloway nodded. Once. The way Linda had nodded in her office, weeks ago, when she decided the plan would work. The agreement is signed, the judge said. Both parties were represented by counsel. Both parties had the opportunity to review all attached documents before signing. A financial review was offered and declined. She paused and looked directly at David, not with sympathy, not with judgment, but with the particular kind of clarity that comes from having seen this exact moment play out before, in different forms, with different people. The agreement stands as written. It is final. David stared at her. The color had left his face completely now, not pale exactly, but drained. The way a photograph looks when the contrast has been turned down too far. Everything flattened, everything muted. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man who understood that he had made a mistake he couldn't take back. Robert sat beside him, perfectly still. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, not clasped tightly, not fidgeting, just resting there, the way a man's hands rest when he is trying very hard to remain composed. I watched him for a moment, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not toward David, toward Robert, something close to sympathy. He had tried. In his own way, in the limited way that attorneys can try, he had tried to protect his client. He had noticed things. He had leaned in, whispered, raised his eyebrows in David's direction during mediation sessions in ways that anyone paying attention would have caught. But David hadn't been paying attention. David had never paid attention to the details. It wasn't in his nature. And a lawyer can advise, can flag, can gently steer, but he cannot force a man to read what he doesn't want to read. Robert had done his job. David had simply refused to let him do it well enough. Judge Holloway let the silence sit for another moment. Then she spoke again, not to David this time, but to the room, to the record, to the fluorescent-lit air of that small courtroom that had witnessed so many endings before this one. "For the record," she said, her voice steady and measured, "the settlement agreement before this court is complete, properly executed, and witnessed by counsel on both sides. Mr. Ellison was advised by his attorney that a full financial review of all business assets and liabilities was available prior to signing. That review was declined. Mr. Ellison initialed the acknowledgement on page 31, which states clearly that he understood and accepted the financial disclosure as attached. The court finds no basis for modification or rescission." She paused, looked at David one more time. Not unkindly, but without any softness either. The look of a woman who has seen 1,000 men sit in that exact chair and make that exact mistake, and who has stopped being moved by it the way a surgeon stops being moved by blood. "The dissolution is final," she said. "This court is adjourned." She closed the file, set down her pen, and stood up. And that was it. That was the end of it. Not with a bang, not with a dramatic confrontation or a speech or a moment where someone said something that would echo in the room for years. Just a judge closing a file and standing up and leaving through the door behind her bench, and the fluorescent lights buzzing on, indifferent the way they always did. David stared at her, and then he looked at me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, not what makes a good story, not what sounds satisfying or triumphant or like the ending of something that deserved to end well. What I actually felt. I felt nothing. Not nothing in the way of emptiness, nothing in the way of stillness. The way a lake feels after a storm has passed. The surface calm, the water clear. Everything settled into place. I had spent 2 years building toward this exact moment. 2 years of planning, of watching, of feeding Karen the wrong information and tracing the money through accounts David didn't know I could see, and lying in the dark at night, running through the logic of it one more time, one more time, one more time. 2 years of being invisible on purpose. And now it was done. The thing I had built had done exactly what I built it to do. There was no triumph in it, no surge of adrenaline, no rush of satisfaction, no moment of sweet, clean revenge. There was just the quiet, flat feeling of a thing that has been finished, like closing a file, like turning off a light in a room you're done using. David kept looking at me. His face had gone through several stages. In the last few minutes, shock, then something close to anger, then a kind of desperate searching, as though he were looking at me for the first time and trying to figure out where, exactly, he had gone wrong, where he had missed it, how long it had been going on. I let him look, and then I stood up, picked up my folder, and nodded to Linda. Linda gathered the documents, our copies, already signed, already final, and stood beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Judge Holloway dismissed us with a nod. We walked toward the door. I didn't look back at David, not because I didn't want to, because there was nothing left to see. The hallway outside the courtroom was the same hallway I'd sat in an hour earlier. The same scuffed benches, the same fluorescent buzz, the same tired light falling through windows that needed cleaning. Ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of space that doesn't care what just happened inside the room behind you. Linda walked beside me. We made it to the end of the hallway before she spoke. "It's done," she said. "It's done," I said. She looked at me sideways, a quick, appraising glance, the kind she'd been giving me since the first day I sat in her office. And then she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She put her hand on my arm, just for a moment, just a brief, firm pressure, not a hug, not a pat, just a touch. The kind of touch that says, "I see you," without needing to say anything else. Then she let go, and we walked out of the building together, and the door closed behind us, and the courthouse went on being a courthouse, and the world went on being the world. Outside, it was cold, the kind of February cold that settles into your bones if you stand in it too long. Not brutal, just persistent. The sky was white, not bright white, not the white of sun behind clouds, but the flat, featureless white of a winter day that hasn't decided whether to rain or not. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, my folder under my arm, and breathed, just breathed. The air was sharp and clean and completely indifferent to what had just happened inside that building. Cars moved past on the street below. A woman walked by with a stroller, talking on her phone. Somewhere, a dog barked. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary city, and none of it knew or cared that a marriage had just ended, and a man had just signed away everything he thought he owned, and a woman had just walked out of a courtroom feeling like the ground beneath her had finally stopped moving. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring. I could hear the school hallway behind him. The distant murmur of other kids, the slam of a locker somewhere, the tinny sound of an announcement over the intercom that neither of us could make out. "Mom," he said. "It's done," I said. A pause. Short. The kind of pause that isn't really a pause, but a breath. The breath you take when you've been holding one for a long time and you're finally letting it go. "Okay," he said. Not okay the way David used to say it. Flat, dismissive, a word meant to end a conversation. Okay the way Marcus said it. Steady, certain, a word that meant I understand and I trust you and we're going to be fine all at once. "I'll be home by 4, I said. "I'll be there," he said. And that was it. That was the whole conversation. No dramatics, no tears. No long, meaningful exchange about what it all meant, or what came next, or how we were going to move forward. Just a mother and her son, talking the way they'd always talked. Quietly, honestly, without pretense. I hung up, put the phone in my pocket, stood on the courthouse steps for another moment, feeling the cold air on my face, and then I walked down the steps and across the parking lot to my car. The weeks after the hearing moved the way weeks do when you've been braced for something and it's finally over. Not with a rush, but with a slow, strange lightness. Like a weight you'd been carrying for so long that you'd forgotten it was there, and now it was gone, and your body didn't quite know what to do with itself. Marcus came home that evening, the evening of the hearing, at 4 o'clock. The way he said he would. He walked through the door with his backpack on one shoulder and his jacket half unzipped and his hair doing the thing it did when he'd been running his hands through it all day, which meant he'd been thinking about something hard. He set his backpack down by the door, took off his jacket, hung it on the hook I'd put up 3 weeks earlier, One of the first things I'd done when we moved in, because I wanted this apartment to have the small, ordinary infrastructure of a life. Hooks for jackets, a place for shoes, a kitchen where someone cooked dinner, and someone else came home to eat it. He walked into the kitchen. I was at the stove. Pasta, because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were pasta nights now, a new tradition, small and quiet and entirely ours. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table and watched me for a moment without saying anything. Then, how was it? I didn't turn around. I kept stirring, kept my eyes on the pot, and I told him. Not everything. Not the specific words the judge said, or the way Robert's face looked when he found the disclosure, or the few seconds of silence when David tried to ask for a delay. I told him the shape of it, the way it felt, the way the door closed and stayed closed and didn't open again. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a while. I could hear him thinking. Not literally, of course, but I'd spent 15 years learning to read the silences my son left between sentences, and this one was the kind that meant he was turning something over in his mind, examining it from different angles, the way he did when he was working through a difficult problem. Dad tried to fight it? He asked. Yes, I said. He tried. And the judge said no. The judge said no. Another silence. Shorter this time. Good, Marcus said. Just that. One word. Not with triumph. With something quieter. The quiet relief of a teenager who has been watching his father disappoint him for years and has finally seen someone hold him accountable for it. I turned off the stove, drained the pasta, set 2 bowls on the table, and sat down across from him. We ate dinner in the kind of silence that isn't really silence at all, but conversation without words. The comfortable kind. The kind that only exists between 2 people who have spent enough time together that they don't need to fill every moment with sound. After dinner, Marcus helped me clear the plates, a new habit he'd started on his own, without being asked, and then he went upstairs. I heard his door close, heard his footsteps cross the floor above me, heard the creak of his bed as he sat down on it, and then the apartment was quiet, and I was alone in the kitchen, and the evening light was coming through the window above the sink, and I stood there for a long time with my hands in the warm water, washing the dishes, and feeling the particular kind of peace that comes when a thing you've been carrying for a very long time has finally been set down. David's world contracted quickly after that. Not all at once. These things rarely happen all at once, no matter how it looks from the outside, but fast enough. The business, freed from the careful management I'd quietly been providing for years through back-channel conversations with the accountant David had never bothered to introduce me to, began to struggle in ways that became impossible to hide. The debts came due. The creditors who had been patient, because David had always been charming with creditors, always had a story, always had a plan, stopped being patient. The local paper ran a short piece about a construction company facing liens. David's name was in it. His mother called me about it. Helen, 71 years old, the woman who had spent the entirety of our marriage making it clear, in small and large ways, that I was not quite good enough for her son. Not cruel about it. She wasn't a cruel woman. She was simply a woman who had decided early on that David was extraordinary, and that anyone who married him was, by definition, ordinary. She said it with her eyes more than her words, the way she looked at me across the dinner table at Thanksgiving, the way she smiled when David said something clever and then glanced at me, as though to confirm that I had appreciated it properly. For 12 years, I had absorbed that look, had smiled back, had thanked her for the casserole she brought every Christmas, and had listened to her stories about David's childhood accomplishments with an expression of genuine interest that I had, by that point, perfected to the point of artistry. And now she was calling me on a Tuesday in March, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, to ask, not directly because Helen never asked directly, whether it was true, whether the business was really in trouble, whether David had really signed something he shouldn't have signed. I told her what I knew, not everything, not the details, just the shape of it, the broad, honest outline of what had happened and why. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I see," she said. Finally. 2 words. The most honest thing Helen had ever said to me. And then she hung up, and I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, and I stood there for a moment thinking about all the years I'd spent trying to be seen by a woman who had decided, before I ever walked into the room, that I wasn't worth looking at, and about how strange it was that the moment she finally saw me, really saw me, for the first time, was the moment everything she thought she knew about her son turned out to be wrong. Jenna disappeared somewhere around the 3rd week of March. I don't know the details, and I didn't ask. I imagine the moment she realized that the man she'd been planning a life with had signed away everything he owned, including, implicitly, any future earning potential tied to that business, was not a pleasant one. She was 29. She had options. She took them. I don't blame her for that. David chose her because she was easy to be with, and she chose him because he seemed like exactly the kind of man who would never need her to be anything other than what she already was. They were both wrong about each other in the end. That's how these things usually go. Karen called twice in April. The first time, I let it go to voicemail. The second time, I listened to the message. Her voice was different, smaller, confused, a little frightened. She'd heard about the business. She'd heard about the debts. She'd put together in her own slow way that some of what David had told her over the past year had not been true, and she was calling me because I was the only person she could think of who might understand what she was feeling. I didn't call her back, not out of cruelty, out of the quiet, practical understanding that some doors close and stay closed, and that's not a punishment. It's just the way things are. Karen had been a crack in the wall for years, a well-meaning crack, an unconscious crack, but a crack nonetheless, and the wall was sealed now. I didn't need the crack anymore, and I didn't need to pretend it had never been there. Spring came the way it always does in this part of the country. Slowly, grudgingly, like someone who's been woken up too early and isn't happy about it. The trees along the street outside the apartment started to change. Marcus noticed before I did. He pointed it out one morning on the way to school. "Look, Mom." And I looked, and there they were. Small green things, just barely visible, pushing through the gray. We'd settled into a rhythm by then, a small one, quiet. Nothing like the life I'd had before. The big house, the business dinners, the careful performance of a marriage that had stopped being a marriage years before either of us admitted it. This was different, smaller, mine. I started looking into something new. Not right away. Not until the dust had settled and the paperwork from the hearing had stopped arriving in the mail and the last creditor had stopped calling. But by late March, I was ready. A small business. Something I could run from the apartment, at least at first. Something that used the skills I'd spent 12 years developing without anyone noticing I was developing them. The attention to detail, the patience, the ability to see a problem from the outside in, the way a doctor sees a body, not just the symptoms, but the system. I won't say what it was. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it was mine, not David's. Not ours, mine, built from scratch, with my own money, on my own time, in my own name. And it was small, and it was unglamorous, and it was exactly what I wanted. The last scene of this story is not a scene at all. It's a Tuesday evening in April. Marcus is upstairs doing homework or pretending to do homework or scrolling through his phone the way teenagers do when they think no one is watching. I'm in the kitchen making dinner. Nothing special, just pasta and a salad and a glass of wine. I'm not in a hurry to finish. The window above the sink is open and the air coming in is cool, but not cold anymore. And it smells like rain and dirt, and the particular green smell that means spring has finally decided to show up. I'm standing at the counter, stirring something on the stove, and I'm thinking about nothing in particular. Not about David, not about the hearing, not about Karen or Jenna or Robert Garrett or any of the people who played their parts in this story and then moved on to whatever comes next in their own lives. I'm thinking about Marcus, about the way he looked at me in the car that January morning. "It's going to work, Mom." And about the way he sounded on the phone after the hearing, and about the way he pointed out the trees this morning, and about all the small, quiet moments between us that don't make for good stories, but that are, if I'm being honest, the only things in my life that have ever really mattered. I'm thinking about my mother, about the advice she gave me on the back porch all those years ago. Pay attention to the money. That's where the truth lives. And I'm thinking about the fact that I'm standing in my own kitchen, in my own apartment, making dinner for my son on an ordinary Tuesday evening. And for the first time in 12 years, I don't feel invisible. That's it. That's the whole ending. Not revenge, not wealth, not the dramatic satisfaction of watching someone else's life fall apart. Freedom. The quiet, unglamorous, completely ordinary feeling of finally owning your own life, of waking up in the morning and knowing that the person you see in the mirror is the person you chose to be, not the person someone else needed you to be, not the person the world expected, but yours. That's what it felt like. And on a Tuesday evening in April, with the window open and the pasta boiling and my son upstairs and the spring air coming in, it felt like enough.